Dawn is just beginning to break in the southern Illinois town of Carbondale. A university town today, its tallest buildings are dorms for students. Southern Illinois University was chartered here in 1869, but it would be nearly a century before it would become the dominant player in Carbondale. A half mile to the north, the rising sun illuminates downtown in a fiery orange glow. This was the original heart of Carbondale, and these buildings have stood here for over a century. Carbondale began as a railroad town, and the town square contains reminders of its historic connection. Down the street, the morning Amtrak train to Chicago backs out of the siding where it parks overnight before beginning the day's run. On campus, students begin to arrive for their morning classes. The students are a big part of why the train still runs today. At 7:30 on the dot, the northbound Saluki begins its 310-mile trip to the Windy City. The trains that come and go today are descendants of the trains that first gave life to the city of Carbondale. The Illinois Central Railroad was chartered on February 10, 1851, with construction beginning a year later. The railroad resembled a Y, the line from Cairo splitting near present-day Centralia, with branches to Chicago and East Dubuque on the Mississippi River. The hills of southern Illinois would be the greatest challenge, and surveyors selected a route following the course of a winding stream. Called Drury Creek today, that stream is crossed no less than 10 times in 10 miles. As construction crews worked their way north in August 1853, Daniel Brush of Murfreesboro, along with two partners, purchased 360 acres of land along the route between the planned stations of Makanda and DeSoto. Brush named his new town Carbondale after the abundant coal deposits being discovered in the area, and oversaw construction of a station as plots were laid out for the town. On July 4, 1854, the first train arrived in Carbondale amid an Independence Day celebration.
The inhabitants of the place were not numerous, but all were willing to work and resolved to make a splurge that should astonish not only the natives but strangers and railroaders also. It was announced that a free dinner would be furnished to all, and our people took hold with a will to make the promise good. I'd completed the freight house, afforded space for tables of plank from end to end 100 feet or more in length, arranged so that 500 persons could be seated at one time. About noon, the rumble of the train was heard. Then came the shrill cry of the steam whistle, and soon the locomotive and cars slowed up and came to a stop opposite the freight house. The wonder-struck people shouted, some in terror, all in surprise. The 4th of July oration was pronounced in a grove near the station under a Union banner that I had purchased for the occasion, and the first one, I think, ever hoisted in the county. Daniel Brush.
As crews built their way north, more workers built south from Chicago and East Dubuque, and the last rail was laid on September 27, 1856, south of Effingham. At the time of its completion, the Illinois Central was the longest railroad in the world. As early as 1855, the IC began experimenting with coal as a locomotive fuel. Coal was found to be plentiful in southern Illinois, while finding wood for fuel in the vast prairies of the state was proving to be expensive. Not all were convinced that coal was the answer, as one newspaper columnist wrote,
"To infer that because coal burning has been successful with the Cumberland coal, a like success may be obtained with our Illinois coal is illogical and absurd. I regard the attempt to burn our Illinois coal as irrational, as to try to make a hedge on the open prairie of the Osage orange, or to grow the locust tree successfully in the northern half of our state. Neither can be done." B.F. Johnson.
As it turned out, using southern Illinois coal to fuel the locomotives was not only successful, it cost 2/3 less than wood. Coal mines began springing up around the region, and they needed a way to move their product. The Mount Carbon Coal Company operated a mine at Mount Carbon across the Big Muddy River from Murfreesboro. Looking for a way to ship coal to the Mississippi River, The company changed its name to the Mount Carbon Coal and Railroad Company in 1861 and proceeded to build a railroad. The railroad reached Mount Carbon from Grand Tower in 1866 and then reached Carbondale in 1868. In 1882, the railroad officially changed its name to the Grand Tower and Carbondale. Unofficially, it was known as the Granny Line. East of Carbondale, businessmen were also planning a railroad to the outside world. In early 1871, the Carbondale and Shawneetown was created to build from Carbondale to the Ohio River. Service to Marion began on January 1, 1872, but the Carbondale and Shawneetown would never build any further. In 1873, the Belleville in southern Illinois was completed, linking East St. Louis to the Illinois Central at DuQuoin. The railroad would continue on to Benton and El Dorado in 1880. In 1879, the St. Louis Coal Railroad was incorporated. It leased the Carbondale and Shawneetown, and in 1880 built west from Carbondale to Harrison, northeast of Murfreesboro. In 1881, the St. Louis Central built south from Pinckneyville to Harrison and Murfreesboro, and was leased by the St. Louis Coal Railroad the following year. In 1883, they, along with the Belleville in southern Illinois, came under the control of the St. Louis, Alton, and Terre Haute Railroad. Service was immediately coordinated to St. Louis with the Illinois Central, advertising the new route as the Cairo Short Line. In 1889, the owners of the Granny Line incorporated the Grand Tower and Cape Girardeau Railroad, building a line south from Grand Tower to East Cape Girardeau. At the same time, the St. Louis, Alton, and Terre Haute completed its link to the Ohio River, building from Marion south to Brookport and reaching Paducah through a ferry operation. Also in 1889, the Illinois Central opened its bridge over the Ohio River at Cairo, replacing its ferry boats, and through mergers with Southern Railroads completed a line that reached from Chicago to New Orleans. In 1893, the Grand Tower roads were combined as the Chicago and Texas, named for Texas Junction on the east bank of the Big Muddy across from Murfreesboro. In 1895, the Chicago and Texas built one last line from Carbondale to Johnston City via Herrin. Construction had reached its peak with 3 railroads operating in 6 directions from Carbondale. In 1895, the IC leased the Belleville and Southern Illinois Division of the St. Louis, Alton, and Terre Haute. Then in 1897, the IC leased the Chicago and Texas. Both were purchased outright a few years later. The first thing the IC did was to build track from McClure to Gale in Alexander County, completing a route to the river town of Thebes. With the lines intersecting in Carbondale, the growing city became a logical base for operations. The Cairo Short Line repair shops were relocated from Pinckneyville to Carbondale, as were the Chicago and Texas shops from Mount Carbon. The newly acquired lines, along with the main line between Centralia and Memphis, became the St. Louis Division of the Illinois Central. A division headquarters building was built on the town square in 1899, and improvements were made to the shops and the yard north of town. Downtown, the freight station was moved to allow additional tracks to be built for heavy local business. The freight station was also expanded, with an addition and loading dock added on the north side. 1899 also saw the first consolidation of track as the St. Louis Coal Railroad was abandoned from Carbondale to Harrison. All St. Louis traffic was routed through Murfreesboro via the old Granny Line. The north-south main line through Carbondale was jammed full of trains, and traffic was only getting heavier. So in 1901, the IC began laying a second mainline track. This included building a new bridge over the Big Muddy River north of town, a concrete arch span that was briefly billed as the largest of its kind in the world when it was completed in 1902. Also in 1902, the IC began work to allow St. Louis trains to be routed around the congested main line between Carbondale and the large freight yard at Mounds. This consisted of a short line between Mounds and Olive Branch and a longer line between Pinckneyville and the old Granny Line at Sand Ridge. While the Sand Ridge cutoff was under construction in 1903, another line was built between Christopher and Herrin by way of Ziegler to reach area coal mines. Many of the mine trains would be based in Carbondale. Passenger traffic was heavy at the turn of the century, with trains on the main line and the various branch lines. Despite the volume of passengers at Carbondale, the station was still a tiny wood frame structure that was bursting at the seams. Work began on a new brick station in early 1903. By the end of April, foundation work for the building was mostly complete, and the station opened to the public on Monday, September 21st, 1903. The baggage room, located at the north end of the building, was half the size it is today. The area that today houses the museum was originally the men's waiting room. The ticket office and restrooms were laid out as they are today, and the entire south end of the building consisted of ladies' areas. Outside the waiting rooms were 5 tracks. The nearest was for outbound trains to St. Louis, which were able to go straight out of town without changing tracks. Next were the southbound and northbound tracks for passenger trains, followed by the southbound and northbound freight tracks. Today, only 2 tracks remain. With the coming and going of countless trains over the years, the station was a major focal point in Carbondale and was always a busy place. Robert Presley was from a railroad family and spent many days at the station.
It's hard to explain anymore to young people what the passenger business was back in those days. I mean, you didn't have automobiles like you have now, and you didn't have roads and interstate highways at all, and you didn't have roads like you have now where people get out and travel, and the automobiles were scarce. And there wasn't 2 or 3 cars to every family. There was 1 car to every 10 families maybe, or something like that, you know. So most people traveled by bus or train, and most of them by train because it was more convenient. And so those people would come into Carbondale, and it was just several passenger trains a day. I don't know. You had Panama Limited and the City of Miami and City of New Orleans, which were express passengers. They were the big ones. And then you had one that was called a Seminole, and then you had a train number 25 and 26, which were what we call milk trains. They stopped at every crossing, it seemed like, and they'd pick up cans of cream and vegetables or whatever and put in their baggage cars. We'd go down to the depot at Carbondale and carry suitcases. I mean, some of those trains, were long trains, and those people would get out down there about a block from the depot. So we'd go down there and act as porters. We'd ask them to carry their suitcase or help them carry their luggage, and they'd give you a nickel or a dime, or something for carrying that up there. Oh yeah, we spent a lot of time at the depot. That's how we got our candy money and show money. Any depot you went into, there was people there, and Carbondale would be a 24-hour day thing. And you could go in a depot at Carbondale. Most of the time, you couldn't find a seat hardly in that depot. There'd be so many people in there waiting on trains or waiting for somebody to come in on the train. Back at that time, all your mail was hauled by rail. You had air mail, but you'd have to get the thing in St. Louis or Chicago or someplace to get it started as air mail. And up until there, it was put on those mail cars. And you'd have the mail people, they'd get their stuff ready and get outside of the track. And they'd always have those pull carts they'd take to get the freight off. And they'd run them down the track and set them about where they figured that car was going to stop, that they was going to get their baggage out or whatever. But everything had to be done in a hurry because that train wasn't going to be there very long. And they'd come in there and they'd take when he'd stop that engine, and they would disconnect. They had people down there ready to do it. And they would disconnect that engine, and he'd fly back out that roundhouse. He'd go over on another track and leave his train set, and he'd fly back out the roundhouse. And while they were servicing the train, getting the coaches cleaned and the mail cars switched and whatever, there'd be a little switch engine sitting down there, and anything that had to be switched, he'd take care of that while the big engine was gone, and he'd go out the roundhouse and they would service him out there at the coal chute. They'd put coal on and water and check the engine, make sure everything was okay around the engine. And the engineer always got down with the big long spouted oil can, and he had certain places he would oil on that while they was cleaning the firebox and getting his engine serviced. And then when they get it serviced, and it was rush. And then just as soon as he was serviced, the engineer would get back up on there and they'd fly back downtown, and he'd back in, hook back up on his train again. And by that time they'd have everything done and have their passengers loaded up, and he'd go on south or north, whichever way he was heading in. It was an exciting thing to stand there and watch all that going on, you know. Of course, it was just every day to us because we was there to see it. But you think back on it, it was something that's another thing you miss too about them.
But the railroad was more than just a means of transportation in Carbondale. The Illinois Central was also the largest employer in town. With the offices, stations, shops, maintaining the tracks, and running the trains, the IC had 800 people on the payroll in the 1920s. In 1920, the population of Carbondale was 6,200 people, and the number of students at Southern Illinois University was often fewer than on the railroad payroll. Since shop work had been consolidated in Carbondale in 1899, locomotive repairs had been handled in a small roundhouse north of town. By the teens, far more locomotives were being serviced every day than the little facility could handle. Also, the size of the locomotives themselves was outgrowing both the building and the turntable used to turn the engines around. In 1918, the railroad announced plans to build a larger roundhouse adjacent to the old one, complete with a larger turntable. By 1920, the new roundhouse was in place and the old one was in the process of being removed. In 1928, the IC opened a new freight route diverging from the main line south of Effingham and running nearly arrow straight to Fulton, Kentucky, crossing the Ohio River at Metropolis. The new Edgewood cutoff meant fewer freight trains through Carbondale and the end of the Carbondale district through Marion as the main route to Paducah. It also led to the abandonment of the secondary route from Pinckneyville to Mounds, with both the Sand Ridge cutoff and the Olive Branch line being abandoned. Much of the right-of-way was given to the counties and is used as roads in many places today. Big changes were made to the depot in 1930. The baggage room was doubled with the addition of space for express shipments. A mail area was added to the north end of the building between the baggage room and the restaurant. Both the mail area and the restaurant are gone today, a parking lot in their place. The area housing today's museum was divided into 4 offices, with part of the ladies' area becoming the general waiting room. The large room south of the general waiting room remained a ladies' area, and an addition to the south end of the building housed the Western Union office. Ironically, these changes were made just as the railroad's traffic dropped sharply with the onset of the Great Depression. Patronage on the local passenger trains to the surrounding towns was already on the decline thanks to the spreading network of roads, but the Depression was more than they could endure. Local trains became big money losers, and they were dropped as quickly as regulators would allow. Things were improving by 1936, and the IC tried an experiment to bring travelers back to the rails. A new diesel streamliner was purchased, and it was sent on a barnstorming tour before going into service between Chicago and St. Louis. The Green Diamond made a splash in Carbondale, where 3,000 people came out to see the new train. It wouldn't be until December of 1940 that a streamliner would regularly call at Carbondale. Once again, a large crowd turned out to watch as the new city of Miami made its maiden voyage from Chicago to Miami. The Panama Limited would become a streamliner as well, with the new equipment making its first run on May 3, 1942. The new Panama would be the last new streamliner until the end of World War II. With the threat of Hitler and the Axis powers, shiny new streamlined trains would have to wait. Following the war, the IC resumed improving its passenger trains. Anticipating a post-war boom, new streamlined cars and diesel locomotives were purchased. Older cars were rebuilt as well, finding new life as streamlined lounges and coaches. After the war, the IC in Carbondale continued just as it always had. Robert Presley worked in the roundhouse following his wartime service.
When an engine came in, the first thing they would do is check the boilers to see if they were dirty and add chemical or blow the boilers out or whatever they needed first thing. And then it would go to the cinder pit and they'd dump cinders and clean the firebox. And then it would go to the wash rack and they'd wash it. And then from the wash rack, it would go into the roundhouse. When one came in, you had a machinist would get on it, and they would do their checking the engine, whatever it might be, for an inspection or whatever it might be. And the box packer would do his work, and everybody would have a certain job to do on these engines. They'd come in, then they'd back them back out and get them ready to go on the road again. I'd work with the mechanics and working on the engines, you know, and whatever might be on those, anything except the boilers or the pipe fitting or something like that. Of course, they had at that time they had a blacksmith and a blacksmith helper, and he did a lot of building different parts, you know, and then they had, as I said, they had pipe fitters and a lot of mechanics, a lot of machinists worked there.
While minor derailments and collisions happened with varying frequency over the history of the railroad in Carbondale, there were at least 3 major accidents here. The Illinois Central made headlines twice in early 1909 with 2 passenger train wrecks less than 2 months apart. On February 16th, southbound train number 205 from St. Louis was approaching Carbondale when it derailed near Little Crab Orchard Creek west of Oakland Cemetery. Engineer Malconnery felt a rail give way beneath the engine at around 50 miles per hour, coming to a stop with the mail and baggage cars jackknifed behind. The coaches took the worst of it, one ending up on its side and 2 landing upside down at the Little Crab Orchard Creek Bridge. 3 passengers were killed and 30 were injured. Just a month and a half later, on April 2nd, southbound number 3 from Chicago was entering Carbondale when it derailed at 2:30 in the morning. The locomotive landed on its side with the baggage car jackknifing behind it, crushing a parked freight car in the process. Locomotive fireman John Hamilton of Carbondale was killed when he was thrown from the engine. Several baggage and postal employees were hurt, but no passengers suffered serious injuries. With the wreck happening in the city limits, the aftermath attracted quite a crowd. On March 14, 1938, two freight trains collided head-on at Dillinger Road north of town. The southbound was preparing to enter the freight yard when a northbound ran a stop signal. The engineer and the fireman of the northbound train were killed, and the crushed cab being examined by officials shows how a steam locomotive could offer little protection for the crew in a serious collision. At the dawn of the 20th century, electric interurban railroads were springing up around the U.S. The Murfreesboro Street Railway had begun in 1891, operating a mule-drawn streetcar through town. In 1909, the mules were retired, replaced by an electric streetcar. The name was changed to the Murfreesboro and Southern Illinois Railroad Company, with plans to build to Carbondale and on into Williamson County. It took until November of 1916 for construction to begin, and on July 14, 1917, the rails reached the Carbondale city limits near Prairie Farms on the city's north side. From there, the rails went south along Illinois Avenue, terminating in front of the Franklin Hotel at the intersection of Illinois and Jackson Streets. Plans to continue further east never came to fruition. The electric cars began taking passengers between Carbondale and Murfreesboro on September 1, 1917. At the midway point between the two cities, the interurban established a station at the farm of John Henry. Knowing a good opportunity when he saw it, Mr. Henry built a baseball park on his property. Just like in the fictional Iowa farm and Field of Dreams, he built it, and come they did. His Twin Cities ballpark became one of the premier baseball parks in the region, even hosting a professional team called the Murdales for a time. He then followed it up with a skating rink and dance hall, much to the chagrin of neighbors who periodically called the sheriff to complain about the noise. The lake at Henry Station became the center of a fishing club called the Jackson Country Club. For a time, the interurban did quite a business, taking folks to the country club and the Henry Pleasure Park. But the combination of the tri-state tornado on March 18, 1925 and the construction of Highway 13 killed off the interurban trains. The railroad was sold for scrap in 1927, and today many residents in the area of Henry Station have no idea that there was ever a rail line, ballpark, and amusement park in their neighborhood. The country club lives on today, having built a golf course on the site of John Henry's Pleasure Park. By the 50s, times were changing, and changing fast. Railroads were turning to diesels, which were cheaper to run, could go farther, and required far fewer people to maintain. The IC stuck with steam longer than most, but by the late 50s, steam was on the way out. As the diesels came, the men who kept the steam engines running found themselves out of a job. On February 18, 1959, the last of the blacksmiths and boilermakers were laid off at the roundhouse, and the last of the steam engines in Carbondale were retired within a month. Jobs were cut maintaining cars as well, with all major repair work moving to large shops such as Centralia. Secondary lines were losing freight traffic as well. The Carbondale district had practically no traffic left, and the southern portion between New Denison and Reevesville was abandoned in 1956. Also torn up was the Johnston City district from Johnston City to Herrin. As the ranks of Carbondale residents employed by the railroad thinned, the post-war boom of veterans going to school on the GI Bill swelled the ranks of students at SIU. Through the 50s and 60s, Carbondale transitioned from a railroad town to a college town. Once the life's blood of the town, the railroad was increasingly viewed as an annoyance to Carbondale's citizens and government, who mainly focused on trains backing up traffic downtown. Passengers had taken to the highways in droves since the end of the war, and more passenger trains were discontinued. The last passenger train from Carbondale to St. Louis ran on October 23, 1970. Once over 50 passenger trains a day called at Carbondale, but by 1971, there were only 12. What was happening on the IC was happening all around the country, and faced with the threat of either ending all passenger trains or driving the railroads into bankruptcy, Congress acted by creating Amtrak. The last Illinois Central passenger trains ran on April 30, 1971, with Amtrak taking over the next day. Amtrak would continue the city of New Orleans between Chicago and its namesake, along with the Shawnee between Chicago and Carbondale. During the 70s and 80s, the network of branch lines running from Carbondale fell by the wayside as traffic dried up. In May 1973, the ICG was granted permission to abandon the old Granny line south of Grand Tower, keeping the rest to Carbondale for coal traffic to the Central Illinois Public Service Generating Plant. Then in 1977, permission was granted to sell the Carbondale district from Marion to Craneville to the city of Marion and to abandon the rest. On March 26, 1979, a coal train bound for Grand Tower derailed on the bridge over the Big Muddy River near Sand Ridge. There were no injuries, but several cars went into the river and part of the bridge was destroyed. Repairs were deemed too expensive, and the ICG instead sought approval to abandon the line. Approval wasn't granted until 1982, and in the meantime, CIPS turned to trucks to deliver its coal before switching to natural gas. The old St. Louis district between Piatt's and Virgins was approved for abandonment in early 1984, and in July the railroad announced it was seeking to abandon all tracks from Murfreesboro to Carbondale. Abandonment was approved in January 1985, and the train stopped running soon after. In 1987, the ICG abandoned the last branch line out of Carbondale, with Johnston City District to Herrin. Carbondale, once the junction of three railroads, now was but a point on the map of the Chicago to New Orleans main line. In 1962, the Illinois Central had created a holding company called IC Industries to diversify into new businesses in order to increase investors' returns. By 1968, shareholders had approved a merger between the IC and longtime rival Gulf Mobile and Ohio. Both railroads connected Chicago and St. Louis with the Deep South, and the hope was a combined railroad would be stronger and more profitable. It took over 4 years, but the two railroads merged to form the Illinois Central Gulf in August 1972. Rather than winding up with a strong combined system, IC Industries found itself owning an expensive railroad with parallel main lines and numerous unprofitable branches. Much of the railroad fell into disrepair as management skimped on maintenance in an attempt to save money. Most of the GM&O main line through southern Illinois was torn up along with the area branch lines. On June 13, 1982, the ICG announced it was eliminating the St. Louis division as part of a restructuring that would consolidate 8 operating divisions into 4. Most of the division would become part of the Midwest division with its headquarters in Champaign. The changes went into effect on September 1st, and Carbondale ceased to be an important part of the ICG system. The face of downtown Carbondale was changed forever when an arsonist set fire to the division office building the night of January 10th, 1986. Nobody was injured, but the flames spread quickly in the upper floors of the old wooden building. It was damaged beyond repair and was demolished not long after. In a way, the fate of the landmark building symbolized the decline of the railroad's importance to the city of Carbondale. IC Industries had been trying to find a buyer for the railroad for nearly a decade, and ICG President Harry Bruce decided to try a new tactic. If nobody wanted to buy the entire railroad, they would sell it off a piece at a time. In 1985, the Iowa division was sold off, along with much of the former GM&O in Mississippi. Additional lines in Mississippi and Louisiana went in 1986, as did the Kentucky division. Finally, in 1987, most of the former GM&O lines from Chicago to St. Louis and Kansas City were sold off. In 1988, IC Industries washed its hands of the rest of the railroad, which returned to the Illinois Central name and was spun off to its investors and employees. So eager was the holding company to sever its connection to the railroad, it immediately changed its name to the Whitman Corporation after a line of chocolate candies. Today, it's part of PepsiCo. The IC's new management immediately went to work streamlining the operation, retiring older locomotives and reducing the main line from double track to single track. The southbound main south of Carbondale was taken out of service on July 19, 1990, as the new junction called South Carbondale was put into service. North Carbondale would be put into service a month and a half later, and the second tracks would be removed soon after. Carbondale became a place for trains to meet, waiting their turn to use the single main track. The steps made to increase efficiency and profitability also made the railroad an attractive merger target. On February 10, 1998, the Canadian National Railway announced it had made a deal to purchase the Illinois Central Railroad for $2.4 billion. June 30, 1999 was the last day the IC existed as an independent railroad. Canadian National took over the next day. Thanks to Amtrak, Carbondale had kept its passenger trains. The Shawnee and the city of New Orleans continued to call at the old station downtown, just as every passenger train had since 1903. The station, however, was getting run down and was showing its age. As far back as April 1973, ideas had been discussed for replacing the station. But it wasn't until June 1979 that a design was approved by the City Council with funding in place. By early 1981, land was purchased on South Illinois Avenue, and existing buildings were demolished to make way for the new station. Construction began in the spring with a parking lot south of the building. Work continued through the summer, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony was held on October 8th. Due to legal issues with the title to the building, it wasn't until Monday, December 21st, that the first train passed by the old station and continued another block to the new building. For a time, the ICG leased space in the old depot to local businesses. After the division headquarters was destroyed in 1986, the remaining offices were split between the freight station and the old depot. Then, as the 80s came to a close, a citizens group called Carbondale Uptown began working on revitalizing the downtown area. A key part of the plan called for the city to acquire the railroad property adjacent to the tracks through downtown. The City Council authorized the purchase in September 1989. Within Carbondale Uptown, a group formed called the Station Carbondale Restoration Committee, with plans to restore the passenger station and place a railroad museum inside. An examination found the building to be in fair condition, and by October 1990, plans were in the offing to not only restore the old depot, but to transform the freight station into an open-air pavilion. In January 1991, the City Council approved designating the passenger station as a city landmark. A month later, a $210,000 plan to restore the building to its 1930 appearance was approved. Meanwhile, crews worked to demolish the 1900 addition to the freight station, leaving just the original building standing. Through the winter and spring of 1992, restoration was done on the exterior of the old depot, and a short display track was installed on the east side. Then, in the fall, the freight station was converted into an open pavilion using the original wooden beams first erected when the railroad arrived in 1854. The marks left where the beams were cut by hand can be seen to this day. It would take 5 years for restoration of the interior of the old depot to be completed, and in 1997 the station again was open to the public. The Carbondale Convention and Tourism Bureau moved their offices into the south end of the building, while a display room opened in the old men's waiting room. In 1998, the Illinois Central Railroad restored and donated a caboose, and it was placed on the display track outside. Also in 1998, a statue of a passenger train conductor with a lantern in one hand and his watch in the other was erected nearby. Station Carbondale member Roy Clark, himself a retired conductor, served as the model for the statue. 2 years later, the railroad donated a retired diesel locomotive for display along with the caboose. Sitting outside the old depot is Illinois Central locomotive number 8701, on display since it was moved into place on November 29, 2000. The engine is classified as a GP11, originally built by the Electromotive Division of General Motors and remanufactured at the Illinois Central shops at Paducah, Kentucky in 1979. This locomotive was originally built in September 1957 for the Union Pacific Railroad as GP9B number 318B. The B indicated that it was built without a cab and could only be operated from another locomotive. The GP9 produced 1,750 horsepower and was a popular and dependable locomotive. By the mid-70s, however, Union Pacific had moved on to more powerful locomotives and the 318B was retired. Illinois Central Gulf bought the locomotive and sent it to Paducah, where it was rebuilt with an improved electrical system, remanufactured parts, and a modern cab was installed. Emerging from Paducah, the locomotive was given the number 8701, and it would carry that number for the rest of its career. The locomotive was donated by the Canadian National Railway following its retirement. While the 8701 does not operate, another GP11, number 8733, operates regularly at the Monticello Railway Museum near Champaign in central Illinois. In June 2002, the old depot was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Today, trains still pass by the building that has stood for over a century. Amtrak trains still call at the 1981 station to the south, while the freight trains wear the colors of the Canadian National Railway, which absorbed the Illinois Central in 1999. The old depot serves as a reminder of the days when the railroad was at the heart of Carbondale's existence.